Flowey Is Not a Good Life Coach by UnrestedJade. Chapter 24. You Will Be Killed by Demon. It was an effort for Papyrus to get any words out, like he was in a nightmare where he could neither speak nor scream. His voice, when it finally cooperated, was weak, breathless. Sans, run! Sans edged half a step back. What the hell is this thing? A wary scowl clouded his face as he picked up on Papyrus's distress. Run, Papyrus pleaded, softly, gripped with terror at what might happen if he made too much noise, if he disrupted whatever fragile spell was keeping Flowey from making a move. Run, Sans, run! The faraway feeling was seeping into his head again, and no, he couldn't afford to do that now. He had to stay alert. He had to be ready to do, God, something, anything. Yeah, Sans, Flowey echoed, giggling. Run! I've never seen you run before. It should be good for a laugh, don't you think? Stepping forward, Sans regarded Flowey carefully, the lights of his eyes tightly focused and glimmering. Who are you? Papyrus wasn't fully recovered, but his magic was strong enough to once more fight his control, boiling and building in an upward spiral even as his body remained frozen in mortal fear. He couldn't breathe, couldn't calm down. It was still too soon. He'd really needed that extra hour of rest, or even 30 minutes. What if he couldn't? No, he had to win this time. He had to. I told you you'd hate yourself, didn't I? I tried to tell you, Flowey said, ignoring Sans' question to address Papyrus instead. Still think you made the right call? He laughed. Now you have one last chance to make up for how selfish and short-sighted you've been. Be rational. Rationality had no part in Papyrus's reaction. All thoughts of magic and probabilities and worst-case scenarios evaporated in an instant. Dread and rage and the remembered sensation of dust coating his fingers drove him to turn on Flowey, to lunge. Think how much worse it would feel if that dust were someone you actually cared about. Something obscured his vision, and there was a pressure, so much pressure. Papyrus lifted his hands to claw at the vine wrapped around his head, and the world stuttered. The world stuttered. The world stuttered. The world... Enough! Sans' voice cracked, unused to shouting. Flowey loosened his grip, the vine sliding down to leash Papyrus by the neck. Papyrus blinked. Not one, but a trio of blasters surrounded him, drifting with jaws open and ready. The soft hissing could have come from them, or from the breeze stirring up the snow. It was difficult to tell. Gingerly, Papyrus ran his fingers over his temples. No damage, which was surprising for some reason. He'd felt, or had he? No, he couldn't have. He was fine. Nothing had even happened. The vine that had come close to crushing his skull now hung heavy around his neck. Next to him, Flowey stared at Sans, mouth slack and eyes wide and gleaming. You, Flowey said, breathlessly. You know what just happened, don't you? His mouth split in a wide grin, and a light shiver ran through the vine. That could not possibly be good. Oh, Sans, I've had you pegged all wrong. Here I thought you were the boring one. Flowey giggled, delighted. Questions tumbled out in a giddy rush. Did you keep count? How many times did I crush him? Do you remember, or are you just aware? Have you always been special like this, or did it come on suddenly? Tell me everything. Wait, he added, though Sans hadn't answered. I don't want any spoilers. Let me figure it out on my own. This explains so much about you. Flowey's grin turned sharp-edged. No wonder you're so idle. You know better. What? Papyrus started, only to gasp when the vine tightened. He could hear the gorget creak. It would be no protection at all if Flowey decided to really squeeze. One hand flew up to grab at the coils, for all the good that would do. Flowey barely glanced at him, staring greedily at Sans. Shut up, Papyrus. Shut up, Papyrus. The adults are talking. 3 points of light flared in the backs of the blasters' mouths, the only visible sign of Sans' anger. Stop it, Sans hissed. Let him go. Geez, Sans, missed opportunity. You could have told me to leave him alone at least. But really, we both know you're not going to do anything while he's in the way, Flowey said, winking. Or are you banking on me unkilling him again? If you want a free shot, all you have to do is ask. Lips pulled back farther over those thorny teeth. He's been driving you crazy, hasn't he? Go ahead. Let it all out. Papyrus stumbled as Flowey tugged him to the side, putting him in line with the nearest blaster. He'll never even know, and I won't snitch. No harm done. The three stood in a tense silence, staring one another down. Papyrus didn't dare speak, confused and frightened. The light at the back of the blaster's mouth kept drawing his gaze, mesmerizing. He knew Sans would never hurt him, but this was still a very unsafe place to stand. Flowey giggled. Looks like we're all walking on the edge, huh? How thrilling! He pulled gently on Papyrus's makeshift leash. Are you sure you're not the least bit curious, Sans? Now's the time to try, like I said. It's really quite liberating. The blaster drifted aside, its muzzle reorienting to point safely away. No longer entranced by the pilot light, Papyrus turned his frantic attention to figuring out what on earth was going on. He'd missed something important in the half-second he'd been blinded by the vine, and the stuttering sensation passed over him. What was he missing? This wasn't the time to be caught off balance. This whole time, you're the one who's been... Sans kept his gaze fixed on Flowey, staring him down with darkened eye sockets, wary and tense. What are you? The vine around Papyrus's neck flexed as Flowey laughed. Papyrus knows? Flowey bobbed on his stem, still smiling hideously wide. But wouldn't you rather solve this one yourself, Sans? New experiences are so rare, aren't they? It's hell to be bored. Sans' face was a flat mask. Think I'd rather just kill you now. Flowey laughed again, genuine and childlike. He dragged Papyrus over to shield himself, or perhaps just to taunt Sans further. That is one possible outcome. Wowee! Flowey crooned, mocking. Who would have thought sleepy old Sans had a violent streak? But then you must be pretty pissed to call up 3 of those puppies. He gestured to the blasters still hovering overhead, lethal but useless as long as Papyrus was close enough to be caught in the crossfire. Papyrus can barely manage 1, even with my best encouragement. Sans paced like a beast in a cage, growling low. You know, I envy you," Flowey said, readjusting Papyrus so he could see around him better. "This uncertainty is exhilarating, and you actually get to feel it." This was strange. Everything about the last few minutes felt unnatural and wrong. Flowey had Sans cold, but he wasn't moving to attack, just goading him. Why? Something about Sans had Flowey totally enraptured. As much as it made Papyrus's insides crawl to think of Flowey focusing any amount of interest on his brother, it opened up a chance at gaining a slight advantage. Every minute Sans kept Flowey talking, Papyrus's magic recovered a bit more, praying that it would make any difference at all when the baffling conversation ended, as it inevitably would. "You could try to enter in the spirit of all this a little bit, trash bag. We're the only two beings here with any kind of persistence. The only ones who are really real. Your brother is a neat toy. My favorite, in fact," Flowey said, though he was ignoring said toy entirely. "But a playmate would be grand. Do you know how long it's been since there were consequences to anything I did? Nothing I do matters. I'm sure you can relate." Carefully, Papyrus shot his brother a pointed look. It was impossible to tell exactly where Sans was looking with the lights of his eyes out. Impossible to know if he'd caught Papyrus's gesture. Keep him distracted. Once Papyrus made his move, there would be no second chances. His timing had to be right. Angling his body to hide his hand from view, he conjured a small attack, keeping it close to his palm. Slowly, he fed it with blue. Sans flexed hands that were wreathed in blue flame. "Stop hiding behind my brother and I'll show you consequences." "Now that I would like to see," Flowey said, stretching up taller. "What exactly do you intend to do?" Papyrus bit down on a curse. No, that wasn't what he wanted at all. What did Sans think he was doing? Sidestepping to get a clear shot, Sans flicked his wrist. A line of bones flew out arrow straight into Flowey's stem. They didn't even leave a visible mark. "Wow," Flowey said, eyes wide. "Lame. That's it?" A vine popped up from the ground. "Guess it's my turn now, huh?" He made a grab for Sans. Sans dove to the side. The vine twisted around empty air. "Pretty quick for a lazy slob." Flowey lashed out again, only for Sans to switch direction and duck under the vine as it whipped past. Flowey seemed to find this hilarious. Giggling, he brought out a few more vines, playfully swatting at Sans to see him dodge out of the way over and over. Papyrus's soul caught in his throat at the sight, but Sans avoided the vines easily. Meanwhile, the vine around his own neck loosened, draped over his shoulders like a heavy necklace. Papyrus glanced down at the vine, looking up at Flowey watching his brother with amusement. Slowly, cautiously, Papyrus shrugged off the relaxed coils. He stood still, waiting for Flowey to notice that he'd slipped the leash. Flowey didn't. His attention was fully occupied by his new victim. With only the slightest rustle of metal on metal to give him away, Papyrus edged closer to Flowey. His attack was as ready as it ever would be, and Sans wouldn't be able to dodge forever. As if the thought alone had jinxed him, Papyrus heard his brother cry out. A vine grazed Sans' shin, tripping him up and sending him tumbling to the ground. Sans pushed himself up, only to fall to one knee with a pained hiss as he clutched at his ankle. "Golly, you sure are fragile," Flowey said, tilting his head as he watched Sans try and fail once more to get to his feet. I'll have to be careful to not kill you too fast. This close, there was no way he could miss. Papyrus sprang forward, pressing his attack into Flowey's main stem. Mustering his will, Papyrus pushed down with weight that wasn't weight. Flowey let out a startled squawk as he crashed to the ground, vines and all. Papyrus was already running, closing the distance between himself and Sans in a matter of seconds. He threw himself over his brother, grunting as a spray of bullets peppered his back. Light wounds for him. For Sans, it would have been far too much. Papyrus twisted, slinging Sans onto his back as he forced himself back on his feet. Sans, fortunately, had the presence of mind to hang on. "You okay?" Sans asked, shoving his right arm under a handy armor strap at Papyrus's shoulder and scrambling for footholds. Even if he lost his grip for a moment, he wouldn't get thrown off right away. Sans wasn't terribly heavy, but on top of the armor, Papyrus was struggling. The pressure against his back hurt like hell. "I'm fine," Papyrus said, dodging a sluggish vine. "You?" Keeping Flowey blue was tiring. He didn't know how long he'd be able to keep this up. "Fucking ankle's busted." Sans hissed at every sudden movement, but whatever pain he was in wasn't affecting his grip. Movement at the corner of Papyrus's vision caught his attention. A heavier vine that had picked up enough momentum to make up for being blue was already too close to avoid. Bracing for impact, Papyrus turned to face it head-on. The world stuttered, and he staggered, traces of vertigo making his head spin. Papyrus blinked. They were behind Flowey somehow, well away from the vine, which slammed down onto empty footprints. Sans cursed. "Cheating shithead weed bastard!" "What?" Papyrus looked down at the snow, wondering if he'd somehow forgotten the last few seconds. No prints led to where he was standing now. How? How in the... "Just go with it," Sans said. "Freak out later." "What?" Papyrus twisted, glancing back over his shoulder at Sans. "Did you do that?" "We can talk about it later." Flowey turned to face them, struggling under the blue. "Neat trick," he giggled. "You're not trying to run away, are you, Sans? That's not very sporting." Sans replied by firing all 3 blasters at once. They didn't last more than a second each. Flowey didn't even make an attempt to dodge while weighed down with blue, the beams colliding with his stem on all 3 sides, leaving only small black scorches on his otherwise green body. "Sans," Papyrus said, "if you can leave, then please." Summoning a fresh blaster, Sans fired again, a quick burst that bought Papyrus time to get moving. The area was littered with pine trees, but there was enough space between them to maneuver, the trunks providing some limited cover. "No way in hell. I'm not leaving you," Sans said, tightening his grip as Papyrus leapt clear of another vine. "We deal with this together." Another salvo of bullets filled the air. Papyrus had just enough time to raise a defensive wall, bullets shattering against heavy bones. God, he needed to focus. Blue didn't work on attacks, only bodies. Flowey wasn't even attacking in earnest yet. He was playing. "Sans, he's dangerous," Papyrus pleaded, moving continuously out of fear that a vine would outflank him. "I can't let him hurt anyone else. If you can do whatever it was you did, and warn the town." "Like I give a shit about the town right now," Sans snapped. "I kinda doubt it's gonna let either of us go anyway. Just a hunch." His teeth ground together. "Is this the thing that's been messing with you?" It was phrased as a question, but Sans clearly had made the connection already. Papyrus stung a too-close vine with a blue attack. Yes. There was no point in lying anymore. At least he could die honest. A wordless, ugly noise bubbled up from Sans' chest. "Then this fucker's gonna die today," he growled. Flowey laughed as Sans fired another blaster on him. It was a solid hit, the short, blinding burst scorching his side for only a second. "Ha! Even your blasters are weak! What even?" He trailed off, grins slipping as a look of confusion spread on his face. "Huh, that's new." Papyrus heard Sans snicker. "Weak, huh?" his brother muttered to himself. Sans readjusted his grip. "Okay," he said. "I got your back, bro." "We can take this thing." Papyrus nodded. There was no time to argue about it. "I won't let anything hit you." "I know. Here," Sans said, and Papyrus felt all resistance to his blue disappear. "No offense, but I'm better at that than you, bro." Gratefully, Papyrus let go of his own blue. Just holding Flowey down for a brief time had taken more energy than he could spare. Whatever Flowey was pondering wore off, his eyes tracking them with sadistic glee as his trademark smirk spread across his face once again. Papyrus jumped aside as a vine erupted clumsily from the ground. He wasn't as agile with Sans on his back, top-heavy and weighed down, but he had an excellent motivation to keep his footing. Splitting his concentration between avoiding Flowey's vines and defending against his bullets, while also not running into a tree or tripping over snow-covered underbrush, was taxing. Flowey was moving slower than normal, though, and Papyrus fought him enough to know his subtle habits and tells. Papyrus fell into a rhythm, circling Flowey at a distance, doubling back and weaving around vines. The world narrowed down into run, weave, jump, block, repeat. Now and then he had no choice but to take a hit, but as long as nothing struck him from behind, he didn't care. Sans took care of their offense, and Papyrus was left wondering if it was really the same person he'd criticized on the hill. There was no opening his brother couldn't take advantage of, and despite being injured and stuck being carried around like a backpack, he attacked viciously. A vine slipped around the tree and shot out at an unexpected angle. With the extra weight, Papyrus couldn't change direction fast enough without leaving Sans exposed. He gasped as the vine connected with his midsection, sending him staggering. "Bro, you okay?" Papyrus twisted to avoid falling on his back and threw out his right arm to catch himself, regaining his balance. "Fine," he grunted, pushing himself up off the snow and back into motion again. He'd been knocked out from behind his defensive wall. Hurriedly, he pulled it up level with the two of them again, bones ripping along the frozen ground. Sans aimed a wave of bones through one of the gaps. "Sorry," he said. "I'll try to keep an eye on those." Flowey leaned out of the way of the attack, too slow due to the blue, or maybe he wasn't really trying. The wave grazed his side. It barely fazed him. "I'm fine," Papyrus repeated. "Just stay on him." He could take the hit. The vines were merely distractions. They weren't vital, and it would only be a waste of Sans' energy to attack them. The snow in his path shifted, and Papyrus slid to a stop as another vine pushed up from the ground. With a soft sound of dismay, he moved the wall between them and the vine to cover their retreat, lurching into motion again. Flowey labored under the blue. It was stronger than usual, and coupled with the labyrinth of tree roots in his way, movement was annoyingly difficult. But perhaps it was only fair that he fight with a handicap, seeing as Papyrus was stuck lugging around a bag of trash. Besides, it added an element of interest to a fight that would have been boring and one-sided otherwise. He watched like a cat stalking a mouse as Papyrus darted in and out between the trees, circling him. His no longer useless brother kept sending attacks at weird intervals, some of which Flowey couldn't see coming until they were on him. Not that he cared all too much. Slowed down too much to dodge, Flowey simply let some of the brother's attacks hit him. Sans was still an absolute joke. So weak. Even his blasters let off just a brief flash of magic before falling apart. Wet tissue paper would have hurt more. Still, something about them left Flowey with the feeling that something was sneaking up on him. It was terribly fascinating. Giggling, Flowey went out of his way to maneuver a vine into Papyrus's path. There was no way he'd be fast enough to connect, but it was worth the effort just to watch his favorite practically fall over himself to get away. Papyrus was working so hard to keep his worthless brother out of harm's way. No matter what Flowey tried, Papyrus wouldn't allow him to land a hit on Sans. Not that he really wanted to. Not yet, anyway. He was enjoying watching them dance. The rising whistle of bullets approaching sent Papyrus diving behind a tree trunk that wasn't quite wide enough. He twisted to keep Sans out of the line of fire. Chips of bark pelted his face as the bullets connected with the tree. A few strays pinged against his armor, and one bit into a narrow gap between breastplate and pauldron. He stumbled back, reaching up to clutch at his wounded shoulder, and stepped into nothing. The forest was gone. They were in free fall, but they weren't moving, or at least no air was moving past them. Papyrus looked around, finding nothing to orient himself with. It wasn't too dark to see, but there was nothing to see. There was nothing at all. "Okay, so," Sans said, his voice oddly muffled despite being so near to Papyrus's skull. "I can't keep us out here real long. Are you gonna be ready to hit the ground running when we load back in?" "What?" Sans sighed. "Bro, this isn't working. You're taking too many hits." Papyrus bristled. "I'm fine." "Don't say you're fine," Sans snapped. "Look, I want to help you out, but I need to know you'll be able to roll with it. If you freak out like you did the last time I moved us, we're gonna get smeared." This was altogether too much for one day. Papyrus shrugged helplessly, his shoulder flaring with pain. "You mean," he said, wrestling his mind back on track when it started to wander back to the vast not black all around them, "can I handle suddenly being in a totally different place with no warning?" "That's exactly what I mean, yes." He couldn't handle it, but the longer they were in this, wherever they were, the more Papyrus noticed how battered and sore he was. Sans was right. Papyrus sighed. "It's worth trying." "Okay." Sans was quiet for a few seconds. "Be ready to run to the left?" "Yeah, left." Light and sound and matter reappeared, and there was ground beneath Papyrus's feet again. Forcing himself not to think, Papyrus darted to the left, putting them behind Flowey. They were now completely on the other side of the small clearing. He could just see the bones of his defensive wall dissipating, some 50 paces away, where they'd been standing before. That couldn't be right, could it? They'd been in that empty, not really a place maybe for a couple of minutes. Those bones should have been long gone. He was definitely not freaking out, but he was losing focus and this was not the time for that. Right. Papyrus got moving again, resolving to just roll with it, as his brother put it. Sans knew what he was doing. A small group of monsters stood at the western edge of town, staring out over the suspension bridge that led into the woods. The snowdrake girl leaned dozing against one of the bridge piers, steadfastly refusing to rest inside the inn. Groups of dotted line footprints stitched patterns in the snow and disappeared past the tree line where the search parties had split up. One set of tracks belonged to Undyne. Alphys jumped as a brilliant flash of light broke through the forest canopy. Removing her glasses, she rubbed at her eyes to dispel the color spots dancing in her vision. Though it had been miles away, the unnatural brightness of the light had dazzled her, like a giant camera flash. Or a magical discharge. Late at night, when power usage was low, the core threw off raw magic in similar bright, short-lived arcs. Alphys didn't know of any backup generators in Snowdin. A low grumble rolled through the air, seconds after the light had faded. Intermittent flickers of light glowed in the distance, outlining the treetops. The greater dog let out a soft growl, ears pinned back, and the Snowdrake girl startled from her nap. Grilby remained as unruffled as ever, but sidled closer to the bridge. He could burn through the ropes in seconds if the need arose. Hopefully, it wouldn't. Papyrus surprised himself with how quickly he adjusted to Sand's strange ability. For the first few jumps, it took a second to orient himself, but soon enough he simply kept moving without missing a beat. Once or twice, he could swear he caught a glimpse of the two of them through the trees, a lingering afterimage in the space they just occupied. Sans barked an instruction or a warning, but for the most part they fought in silence. Papyrus had far too much to keep track of to talk or do much listening, and Sans was giving it his all. Seemingly weak blasters herded Flowey into blue attacks. Papyrus cornered Flowey into attacks that drifted lazily through the air but seemed to sting for far longer than they should have before dissipating. There were several long trenches in the snow from the blasters in Papyrus's footsteps as he darted back and forth, continuously circling the malignant plant. Flowey occasionally fought the blue, bobbing and twisting around attacks, sometimes only suffering a slight graze. Sans and Papyrus didn't need to talk. The jumps never really caught him off guard, even without advance warning. Their attacks wove together, augmenting one another. Papyrus didn't know why, but it was easy to guess at Sans' intentions, and it seemed the same for his brother. There was no good reason for why that should be so. They had never practiced together, and Sans was using techniques that Papyrus wasn't familiar with. It was like a muscle memory he'd never actually learned in the first place. It just worked. Fighting in tandem felt like the most natural thing in the world. If they hadn't been fighting for their lives, it would have been a joyful feeling. Papyrus could do this forever. In theory, anyway. In reality, Papyrus was getting tired. Sans was slowing down too, attacks rippling out at longer intervals and shorter durations. Papyrus could hear him breathing hard and feel him shaking. Flowey was looking much worse for wear. Not long into the fight, he'd even stopped taunting them, too focused to speak, though he never stopped smiling. Severed pieces of his body littered the snow, and he was more black than green. But he was still moving, still attacking. His thick, elongated body weaved about like a drunken snake thanks to the blue. White bullets still flew and vines whipped sluggishly through the air, trying to catch either of the brothers as they scurried to and fro, throwing off their own attacks. Sometimes Flowey even managed to smack away an attack or lean completely away from a blaster's path. He was strong, and at this rate they might not outlast him. Papyrus grimaced, lurching out of the way of a vine. For every minute the fight dragged on, it was taking more effort to stay ahead of Flowey's attacks. And if Flowey managed to get free of the blue, he could easily escape or kill them outright, and all their efforts would come to nothing. "We caught him on the ropes," Sans said, voice raspy. "Any minute now." Right. Negativity wouldn't help. They were close. Flowey was moving, but it was labored. His attacks were sloppy. They could finish this. They had to. Papyrus and his trash bag brother flitted about him like a pair of particularly angry wasps, popping in and out of view and managing to stay just ahead of him. The battle remained in the ruined clearing, Flowey finding himself turning in slow circles trying to catch them. Scarred trees and churned earth marked his efforts. That was such a neat trick Sans had. It was a shame Papyrus's brother was so delicate. Or Flowey might have found out about some of his hidden depths a lot sooner. He'd always died so early, but now that Flowey had a good reason to be extra special careful with him, all kinds of fun new games sprang to mind. Maybe next time. For now, Flowey needed to focus. How long it had been since he'd had to try this hard. He couldn't even remember. He giggled as another one of those curious bone attacks of Sans dug into his side. Another cool trick. Even if Flowey could feel pain, he doubted Sans' attacks would hurt very much, but they inflicted a deceptively large amount of harm. It was a slow burn of sorts. The attack dissolved, but the gash continued to widen for a few seconds. Amazing! Leave it to the laziest monster in the underground to have the most efficient attacks. Sans was doing more damage than his brother, a monster who could hit much harder. Speaking of Papyrus, he was doing so well. For the first time, he showed no trace of hesitation or conflicted feelings. Single-minded determination was etched into every movement, every attack. He'd have looked a lot cooler without his brother clinging to him, but he still looked pretty cool. Sure, if Flowey had feelings to hurt, Papyrus's total rejection of him in favor of his stupid brother might have stung. As interesting as Sans was turning out to be, Flowey certainly didn't like him, and didn't appreciate him butting in where he wasn't wanted. But positive results were positive results, even if Flowey himself ended up being the target. Disentangling himself from a nest of Papyrus's stinging blue attacks, Flowey blundered into two of Sans' blasters. Fresh cuts cauterized in the blast as his tissues dried up further on his upper stem, close to his face. He noted the loss of a few more petals with detached annoyance. Technically, he should dock Papyrus points for having help, but Flowey had to admit they were doing quite well together. Maybe too well. They were clearly starting to tire out, but so was he. Papyrus and Sans were a far cry from either of his parents as far as pure strength went, but they were turning out to be dangerous in their own rights when properly motivated. For the first time, it occurred to him that he might not win. Incredible! Uncertainty, urgency, mortal peril. How long had it been? This was all so exciting. Moving like molasses under the blue magic, Flowey flung 3 of his vines at the brothers. Only one connected, catching Papyrus's lower arm before Sans moved them out of the way. Flowey listened for the pop of displaced air, turning to face them again as they reappeared on his right. It was getting easier to follow. Flowey noted with unaccustomed pleasure at the pained grimace on Papyrus's face when he moved his arm. The movement was a little off, a little stiff, and the resulting attack was misaligned. A few bones collided with his brother's, canceling out both waves. Flowey grinned wider. With the possibility of losing the fight came the renewed enjoyment of winning. This was the absolute best run ever. Not good. Flowey was adjusting his strategy. With his attention split between attacking, defending, and maneuvering, Papyrus just couldn't compensate for his arm, which was all but useless. Frustrated, he fell back to purely defending. He was no help to Sans if he couldn't cast an attack precisely enough to avoid interference. God, he was exhausted. Every step was a battle. "Any minute now," Sans urged. His hands slipped, scrabbling painfully at Papyrus's collarbones. Damn it, why couldn't Flowey stay down? How much longer could he possibly last? How much longer could they last? A flash of cyan flickered across the snow. Papyrus staggered to a halt as a flurry of spears whizzed by, so close he could hear them whistle through the air and feel the breeze as they passed. From over his shoulder, Sans gasped. Papyrus knew that magic. Risking a glance to their right, the direction from where the spears had come from, Papyrus shouted and mingled relief and dismay to see Undyne, Dogamy, and Doggeressa through the trees. He didn't want them anywhere near Flowey, but they were fresh, and he and Sans needed help. Flowey turned on them, flinging multiple vines at their approach. The dogs hacked and chopped at any vine that got within reach, defending their captain. Undyne harried the overgrown flower with spears, asking no questions and looking almost gleeful at the chance to beat the life out of something at last. Sans jumped them clear of a barrage of spears that went a little too wide. "She could try not to skewer us while she's at it," he grumbled. Taking advantage of the distraction, Sans dispelled his blasters, resting and rallying what was left of his reserves, which had never been much to start with. His magic was a physical warmth at Papyrus's back, gathering for one more push. Papyrus did the same, tearing down everything save for a defensive cage of bones around them because now was not the time to get careless. Calling on the rest of his magic felt like trying to get the last dregs of a milkshake from the bottom of the glass, but he rolled it up into something he could use. "Hold him!" Papyrus called to Undyne, hoping she would understand. He could see Sans was slowly but surely losing his grip over his blue. The thought of Flowey being able to move normally, able to escape underground out of reach, was not permissible. 1 life for 5, or a town's worth of lives. Or maybe it would be 2 for 4, or 3 for 3. However it balanced out in the end, it did have to end, and soon. A great arc of green that spanned the clearing sliced through the air, perilously close as Papyrus scrambled out of its range. Even if he hadn't been blue, Flowey would have been hard-pressed to dodge it. Papyrus could feel Sans relax incrementally as Undyne's attack took effect, freezing Flowey in place. Every vine went still. Undyne would only be able to keep Flowey still for a couple of minutes at most. They couldn't waste the chance she'd given them. Sans summoned a ring of blasters. So many, too many for Papyrus to count at a glance. Like falling dominoes, they fired, one after another, a fresh blaster taking the place of each one that dissipated. The light was blinding. The roar of them was a physical force, vibrating through the air and the ground and Papyrus's bones. With no more need to dodge around vines, Papyrus could focus all his remaining energy on attacking as well. He still had poor control of his own blaster, but against a stationary target it didn't matter. He summoned it, the stark animal skull like death itself given shape and form, and fired. Everything he had left, he let the blaster take, holding nothing back. The world stuttered, shadows snapping to new angles. Sans blasters were firing from a different part of their ring than they had been, but they were still firing. Flowey was still green. Papyrus held firm. All that mattered was keeping his attack going. He fed magic into the blaster as fast as he could, the beam burning white. The world stuttered, snow unmelting and remelting, images flickering in Papyrus's vision. He was shaken, but unmoved. He kept firing. He'd burn himself out before he let Flowey get away. The world stuttered. A ring of bullets shot past the brothers' collective blasts, as though Flowey somehow knew where the minuscule openings between the blasters were. Moving meant diverting his attention from his blaster, so Papyrus didn't. He felt a bullet graze his cheek, carving a furrow into the bone, felt others pelt against his breastplate as he staggered a half-step back from the force of the impact. A sharp pain in his chest signaled some measure of that force had hurt him even through the armor. No matter. He was still standing. Flowey wasn't going to win. Sans had ducked safely out of the way, but he lost his grip, and Papyrus felt his brother slide off his back and landed on the ground behind him with a sharp cry. In that instant, Sans' ring of blasters disintegrated, glittering spent magic showering over Flowey, a snowstorm in miniature. Keeping his own blaster going, Papyrus quickly turned his head, his soul twisting with panic. Sans! His brother was stunned but alive, curling onto himself as he gripped his bad ankle. He must have landed on it. Glancing around, Papyrus realized Undyne had also been thrown to the ground, the dogs shielding her with their axes. But the green still held. Flowey was still immobile, helpless. Above the subsonic roar of his blaster, Papyrus could hear Undyne's bellow of effort as she fought to keep the green going just a little longer. Green was time-based, but that didn't seem to matter to her. Papyrus gritted his teeth, willing his blaster to keep firing, keeping it from scattering. He risked a quick glance up to see the skull was cracking and splitting. It was all up to him now. Just a little bit more. He pushed yet more magic into his blaster, stumbling forward to bring the cannon closer to its target, lightheaded and disoriented. For just an instant, he could feel the splintering skull above him as though it were his own, see through its sightless sockets. Magic, raw and wild, coursed through it and him. Take everything I have. Protect. Safeguard. Defend. The world stuttered, or maybe it was just dizziness. It hurt now to keep attacking. Papyrus shook, fighting to stay upright and conscious. Magic bled from him, pulled away like water down a drain. He couldn't have held it back now if he wanted to. It ripped away, leaching from his bones themselves. Away, away, away. The blaster's muzzle split and flew apart, and the deep thrum rose to a high whine as the blaster drew out the last scraps of his magic before the rest of the skull shattered. Papyrus's knees hit the ground. Head swimming, vision doubled, he gasped as the connection to his blaster snapped. Spent magic shimmered down around him. Sans was at his side, saying something, but Papyrus couldn't quite parse it. Back in the trees, he could make out the double image of Undyne kneeling, propped up with one of her spears. The dog stood at her sides, panting. He felt a vibration through the ground, turned his head to see Flowey laid out flat in the streaming mud, deflated. The green had worn off. Flowey's head was only a few feet away. With a great effort, Papyrus crawled over to it. Sounds were happening, voices, but that bit of his mind hadn't caught up with the rest quite yet. The stink of burnt vegetation was overpowering. There wasn't a visible inch of Flowey's main body that wasn't charred black and withered. Papyrus reached out, trembling, unsure what exactly he meant to do. Some part of him, the part that let him use his blaster, wanted to beat Flowey's head into a pulp with his bare hands. But that part wasn't in control. Gently, he cradled Flowey's face in his hands. The limp weight of it and the sap that seeped into his joints spoke to the likelihood of Flowey getting up again. Papyrus felt relieved, and then remorseful. This had been the very best of his few horrible options. It was still horrible. Flowey stirred, nuzzling his face against Papyrus's palms. "You never change, do you?" he rasped, blinking up at Papyrus with eyes that had already gone glassy. "But still, you did it. I knew you could." "You need to leave us alone," Papyrus said, at a loss for anything else to say. Flowey chuckled, his smile cracking open fissures on his face. Loose flecks of char fell onto the snow, and rivulets of fresh sap followed. Oh, I wouldn't worry about that, friend. The game's over. He sighed contentedly. I wasn't expecting this ending, but it was so worth it. I haven't had this much fun in ages. I'm sorry. It was an effort to form the words, push them out past his teeth. Everything tingled, unreal and distant. Don't be. A sticky foam formed at the corners of Flowey's mouth, as sap bled into spaces it shouldn't be. I'm super proud of you, Papyrus, he said, voice gurgling. That was cool. Papyrus frowned. I can't heal you. Did Flowey not care? Was he delirious? He wasn't making sense. Nothing made sense. Papyrus stared down at Flowey's head in his hands, hands that felt like someone else's hands. Flowey twitched. No need for that, friend. And hey, I can't love, but I ended up giving you some love. He giggled again at his own joke. Shivering with exhaustion and a wrongness he couldn't place, Papyrus said nothing. The inexplicable desire to clench his fists with what strength he had left, to make that laughter stop for good, swept over and through him. And then it was gone. It was gone, but the memory of that feeling, not rage but a cold wanting, would linger. Flowey would not survive, and Papyrus had struck the killing blow. But even this was not the lowest possible point. There was always something more, something lower. 2 levels. Called it. At some point between the cavalry's arrival and the third, fourth attempt to reload that couldn't reach far back enough, Flowey realized he'd been a little too flippant, careless, overconfident. He hadn't needed to be careful in so long, hadn't had any reason to think he was in real danger in so long. And now, in a matter of seconds, he'd actually lost. What a strange occurrence. What a novelty. Papyrus's blaster was a sun to Sand's false stars. But those sneaky, weak attacks had sapped far more of Flowey's strength than he'd realized. He was helpless to do anything but wait for the inevitable as searing raw magic burned the rest of his life away. He should have been ready to reload the instant Undyne's damned green hit him. Oh well, at least he'd been able to last long enough after the attack to see Papyrus's level go up. Rarities upon rarities. It had been quite a run, and Papyrus couldn't stay mad at him, even after all that. Somehow that was very nice. No hard feelings. Never any hard feelings with Papyrus. Flowey nuzzled into the hands that held his face out of the mud. His favorite. He should reset now, before he waited too long and died for real. He was so comfy right where he was, though. Flowey couldn't feel pain, but a sort of drowsy lightness stole over him. He didn't really want to do anything but lie here and admire his favorite. He really should reset, and he would, in just a moment. Leave it to Flowey to win even by losing. Head swimming, Papyrus held Flowey's understanding gaze, staring into the black, empty eyes that got blacker, emptier. I think, Sand said, pulling Papyrus's attention from the still face. He hadn't heard his brother approach. "I think it's dead, bro." Flowey didn't look dead, but then he didn't look alive anymore either. His blank eyes gazed out at nothing, dull and unfocused. The tip of a limp tongue lolled out from between his teeth. Papyrus laid Flowey's head down in the mud. After a moment, he brushed the eyelids closed with his fingers. It didn't feel right to leave them open. Flowey looked rather peaceful, as badly mangled as he was, like he was sleeping. Come to think of it, Papyrus was feeling very sleepy himself. Undyne's shadow fell over him. Her fins drooped, and her scales were washed out and pale. She glared down at Flowey's body, leaning on the spear she was using as a walking stick. "What was that thing? I've never seen anything like it." "That's what I'd like to know," Sans said, moving to stand before his broken ankle sent him to the ground again. Dogamy stepped forward to help him. "I think we should get back to town first, though. None of us is exactly the picture of health." Accepting Undyne's offered hand, Papyrus let himself be pulled to his feet. He took a step, and his legs gave out, sending him back to the ground with a hard jolt. "Ugh!" he cried, but the shock was already fading, and the pain of his awkward landing felt distant. Sans pushed away from Dogamy to lurch clumsily to his side. "Papyrus! Papyrus, are you okay?" Undyne knelt down, propping him up with strong arms. Her spear scattered, forgotten. Papyrus sagged back against her breastplate. "I don't think—" He heaved a breath. It was hard to talk. "I can't stand up." He couldn't even feel his legs, but he didn't want to alarm anyone. He peered over at his brother, who was gripping his right hand tightly in both of his own. They were strangely clammy. Papyrus scowled. "Why are you all drippy?" Sans barked a short, nervous laugh. "You don't look so hot yourself, bro." The lights of his eyes blazed with anxiety. "Kinda fuzzy around the edges, in fact." "Oh," Papyrus said mildly. Dogamy and Doggeressa crowded at his other side, whining softly, ears pinned back. They fussed over him, removing his armor, cutting straight through the straps and point laces in their haste. That was a little confusing, but it felt so nice to have the weight off him that Papyrus didn't care. He felt so light. He heard Undyne's snarling curses behind him as she struggled with his gambeson. "Damn it," she hissed. "Who designs this stupid bullshit?" There was a pop of seams ripping, and a lot of what Papyrus thought was unnecessary jostling as she tore the garment off of him. He'd just been getting comfortable, too. "Hey," Sans said, and Papyrus blinked his eye sockets open. "You gotta stay awake, okay? Pull yourself together, bro. Get it?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's really terrible," Papyrus said, his voice thin and reedy. Dimly, slowly, it dawned on him that he was dying. He'd taken too many hits. He'd spent all of his magic. He didn't have enough left to maintain his physical form. But they were safe now. He couldn't complain about that. He wasn't scared. It was more like disappointment. He'd almost made it. Sans laughed, or perhaps it was a sob. "There's more where that came from," he said, tears rolling down his cheeks. "And you're gonna hear them all, so don't go to pieces on me." "Awful." Papyrus tried to squeeze the hand holding his, managing just a slight twitch. He felt loose somehow, like he was made of powder snow. A strong breeze would blow him away, carry him all the way up to the stars. He could feel warmth at his back and side, could feel familiar hands gripping his own hard enough to hurt. "It's over now, so you can't leave, okay? Don't leave. Don't leave me here, Papyrus." Everything was fading in and out, blurring. It would be easy to relax into that blur, to just drift off to sleep. But he couldn't leave Sans all alone. Flowey's prediction echoed back to him, and he knew, with knife-sharp clarity, that it would come true. "You have to keep getting out of bed," he wanted to say. "You have to keep leaving the house and talking to people and living. Please, don't just give up. Don't follow me." Too many words. Too hard. He was so tired. He couldn't leave Alphys thinking that he hated her. He couldn't leave Undyne to do all the guard paperwork herself. Everyone had been so worried about him, had been hurt by him. He needed to make it up to them. He didn't want to die. Try as he might, Papyrus couldn't hold on. He was sinking down, floating away, falling apart. It was happening so fast. Magic that was different from his own seared into him, shocking him awake. Instinctively, he tried to squirm out of Undyne's arms, to get away from the burning hands pressed against his rib cage. "You can beat this, Paps, come on!" Undyne's voice quavered, but her hold was unshakable. She curled her arms tighter around him, curled her fingers between his ribs. Every point of contact was electric, scorching. More hands joined hers, and soon the dog's magic added to the torrent. Papyrus couldn't even scream, utterly paralyzed. Nothing Flowey had done to him had hurt like this. Dying hadn't hurt like this. Magic from 3 sources flooded him, colliding, crashing. It was too much at once. He could feel himself being torn apart. And then there was a 4th magic. It didn't add much to the total, a melting icicle on top of the tidal wave. That trickle, that thin thread, wasn't foreign and didn't burn. It was just like his own magic, like him, like home. The storm in his body forgotten, Papyrus was transfixed by the weak glimmer of right magic twisting through him, calling to him. He followed the thread, compelled to reach out, to take hold of it. At once, brilliance engulfed him. It wasn't light, and it wasn't words or even thoughts, but he could see and feel and understand. "Loved," it said. "Needed," it said. "Stay." Papyrus anchored himself to the thread and its brilliant source. The other 3 sources resolved themselves in his awareness. Now that he wasn't caught between them, he could perceive the currents of foreign magic. Hesitant, determined, he reached out to gather them up. By degrees, the separate currents aligned. The chaotic maelstrom of magic resolved into a single pulse. The pain eased. Papyrus was still on the edge of oblivion, but he had a handhold. He would make this magic his own. He would heal. He would stay. He would live. He just had to. Had to. The flashes of light stopped, and the forest was dark once more. That was either good or extremely bad. A magic flare arced up over the treetops, bursting into tiny valentine hearts that shimmered and faded away. Good, then. Alphys's cell phone rang, the ending theme to Mew Mew Kissy Cutie, Undyne's ringtone. Alphys could have wept tears of relief, but she was proud of herself when she kept it together. Over the next couple hours, the search parties trickled back into town. Undyne and her search party were the last to return. All three of them moved sluggishly, Undyne most of all. Straining her eyes, Alphys could see she was carrying someone. No, two someones. Undyne held Papyrus's slim form in her arms. The blue lump draped over her shoulders had to be Sans. A smile spread on Alphys's face. She'd been worried, but Undyne was captain of the guard for a reason. With a soft boof, the greater dog crossed the bridge to meet the returning search party. He took the skeletons from Undyne. Against his much larger bulk, the brothers looked like children. They didn't stir in his arms as he moved carefully back across the bridge, and Alphys's smile wavered. What was wrong with them? She'd assumed they were just worn out, but it was clear from how still and limp they were that they weren't conscious. Stepping onto solid ground again, the greater dog kept to a slow pace, letting Alphys get a look at them both. Sans' face was pinched even as he slept. His ankle was wrapped tightly with a strip of cloth. Papyrus was worse. Naked from the waist up, he was riddled with wounds, some hastily healed, some not. His bones had an almost translucent quality. Just visible inside his chest, his soul flickered candle flame weak. The only hint of tension in his body was his right hand, which was gripping Sans' left hand so hard it was difficult to match up the bones with their respective owners. Alphys knew all too well the look of a monster who had fallen down. The dog-eye and Undyne stepped off the bridge. Undyne's scales were pale, and she was puffing like she'd just run a marathon. Alphys approached. Undyne paused to scoop her off her feet in a brief, tight hug. She set Alphys back down, digging a small object from a pouch at her hip and pressing it into Alphys's hands. A thorn? No, a tooth. There was a murmur of a TV at low volume. There was a spring poking him. Blinking, confused, Papyrus took stock of the situation. 2 arms, 2 legs. His head was attached. Every bone was present and accounted for. And hurting. He was alive. He was alive and on the living room couch. Someone had tried to make it comfortable with every pillow and blanket in the house, but it was still lumpy, and that spring was still digging in. Sans was curled up at the other end of the couch, snoring softly. If he'd had the energy, Papyrus could have cried. He was home. The living room was almost unrecognizable. Filling every corner was a frankly excessive amount of flowers, none of them golden, thank God, parcels and cards. The air smelled of cinnamon bunnies and tomatoes. A lump of fabric on the floor sat up, revealing Alphys wearing his old coat. Her eyes lit up as she noticed him, and she shuffled over to the edge of the couch. "You're awake," she whispered, squinting as she studied him in the dim light of the TV. "How do you feel?" "A lot," Papyrus croaked, unsure if he'd understood the question. "What happened?" Everything after the fight was hazy. He didn't even remember getting back to Snowdon. Alphys frowned. "You fell down." "Really?" Papyrus wasn't sure why that information wasn't more upsetting. "Yeah," Alphys said. "I was starting to think we'd have to, but you woke up on your own, so that's good." She gave him a smile that was a touch too wide. Well, she was still a novice smiler. Gerson's at the inn, but I can call him once you're ready. He'll want to check over you again. Probably Undyne and Sans, too. Papyrus was so tired he was having some trouble following what Alphys was saying, other than things were more or less fine, by whatever standards Alphys was using. Papyrus nodded, since it seemed like some kind of agreement was in order. If he fell asleep again, he really wanted to make it upstairs to his bed at least. What time is it? It's Tuesday. It was an effort to keep his voice down. He didn't want to wake Sans. I've been asleep for 2 days? 2 days? That was obscene. Every inch of his body disagreed with him and wasn't shy about letting him know. Throbbing pain rolled over him in waves, and he was so utterly drained it was an effort just to sit upright. He'd have to avoid brushes with death in the future. 2 days. 2 days since, and everyone was still fine, which meant Flowey must really be dead. Yes, that part was coming back now. Papyrus would have been happy enough if it hadn't. Alphys nodded. Well, it's Tuesday night, so it's actually closer to 3 days. Still, as bad a shape as you were in, I'm amazed it wasn't longer. They were speaking quietly, but Sans stirred at the end of the couch. He blinked his eye sockets open, stretching and popping a few joints. Hey, lazy bones, you're finally up. His voice was hoarse, and his haggard face betrayed how little rest he'd gotten in the last few days. You know, you can't just sleep all the time, Papyrus. It sets a bad example for the rest of us. Standing, Alphys straightened her borrowed coat. I think Undyne needs help in the kitchen. As if on cue, there was a crash from that direction, followed by muffled cursing. Try to stay awake for a few minutes, and I'll bring you something to eat, okay? Papyrus nodded absently, more focused on his brother than Alphys. After a few seconds of careful study, he was mostly satisfied that Sans was all right, albeit worn out. A faint line crossing the end of his tibia was all that remained of the break in his ankle. How are you? Papyrus asked, scraping the words out with a voice that was still reluctant to work properly. Grinning, Sans shook his head. Never better, bro. You? Papyrus shrugged. Fine, he said. Everything hurt, and he had no energy, but he wasn't about to complain. He was alive, and that was more than he'd expected. Heh, well, you look like crap. It hurt to laugh. The tears pricking on the corner of Papyrus's eye sockets were nice, somehow. You're not winning any beauty contests either. Yeah, Sans said, grinning wider. But that's me all the time. He blinked and reached up to scrub one hand across his eye sockets. I'm, really glad you're awake, he said, glancing away. Was starting to think you weren't gonna... Memory seeped back into Papyrus's mind, a slow drip. He'd felt himself starting to crumble and turn to dust. He'd been so close. It would take more than that to stop the great Papyrus, he said, unable to muster up the proper amount of bravado when he still sounded like a frogget with laryngitis. Sans laughed. Such a heartening sound. Off in the kitchen, the distinct whoosh of the stove burner turned too high was accompanied by Alphys's worried stammering. Papyrus smiled. Undyne is still here? Nodding, Sans crossed his arms. We had a talk. That's all I'll say about that for now. But I'm thankful she turned up when she did. He added, Me too. Even now, if he concentrated, Papyrus could feel that a portion of his magic was a little closer to cyan than blue, in a matter of speaking. She's been good crowd control too, Sans said, gesturing at the gifts piled up around the room. I'm pretty sure the whole town's been through here by now. It certainly looked that way. Papyrus wasn't sure why his neighbors had gone to so much trouble, but he was touched by their thoughtfulness. He was going to have a lot of thank you notes to write. Oh no, Papyrus groaned, a thought suddenly occurring to him. And the house is such a wreck. The worry sounded ridiculous even to him, but it was such a normal worry that he clung to it fiercely. He shouldn't feel relieved about any of this. He shouldn't be thinking about petty things, like the state of the house. That was wrong. He should just feel sad, he was sure. He shouldn't feel like he'd had some of the poison drawn out of him, some of his own soul returned to him. He shouldn't feel glad, or good, or happy. Nah, Sans said, waving him off. If he noticed the way Papyrus kept drifting off in thought, he let it go without comment. I guess those rabbit sisters came over with their kids the day we got back and cleaned up the place. I heard tell of a casserole, too, but Undyne and the dogs polished that off before I got up. His laugh was just a shade forced. They spent a lot of magic to keep you in one piece, bro. Yes, they had. That called for more than a thank you note. And the world shouldn't feel brighter right after he'd committed murder. It shouldn't feel like waking up from a nightmare. And yet, Papyrus was really going to cry. He was surrounded by such wonderful people. One of those people ducked her spaghetti sauce-splattered head through the kitchen archway. You dorks ready to eat? Undyne crowed. Black smoke wafted up toward the ceiling behind her. She passed out bowls and flatware before sitting on the floor in front of the couch with her own food. Alphys followed soon after, similarly covered in splotches of red. She grinned sheepishly as she settled down next to Undyne. I made sure it had extra milk, for the calcium. Sounds heavenly, fish face, Sans said, but he ate without complaint. Papyrus smiled, letting the heat from the bowl seep into his hands. He was alive, on their lumpy couch, in their home. His favorite people were here, safe and sound. He took a bite of extra milky spaghetti, letting the others' conversation swirl around him like warm water. He'd done an awful thing. There hadn't been much choice, but he'd done an awful thing all the same. And killing Flowey hadn't undone any of the awful things that had gone before. It was over, but it had happened. It had all happened. Later. He could face all of that later. Now, in this oasis of love and safety and slightly irregular pasta, he let himself be. Right now, he was happy. Hey, this is Katie Lou. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an amazing adventure from start to finish. There is an epilogue to this to come, but I wanted to say a few things at the end of this episode since it's basically the grand finale. First of all, thank you for being as patient as possible waiting for this episode. I had a few things happen to me a couple weeks ago that kind of kept me from being motivated to work, and then when I was motivated to work, I had to do real work at my real job. So I'm recording this Saturday afternoon after I've gotten all of chapter 24 done, all the sound effects, all that stuff. Pretty much everything except sticking this at the end of the video and making the video, even though I promised to have all this done Wednesday. And second, thank you to unrestedjade for writing this story, which I started, I think, back in March now. Oh man, it's been such a long time and so much has changed since I started. I'm kind of blown away every time I think of where I started, what I started with, and where everything has gone from there, how my skills have developed, how my subscriber count's gone up, and just everything is so amazing, and I'm so thankful for all of you every day. And going forward with my channel, it's my goal to have one long fanfiction going on at a time. So Flowey Is Not a Good Life Coach is ending soon. We're gonna have the epilogue and then a couple follow-ups written by unrestedjade and someone else who I met on Tumblr. Speaking of Tumblr, there's a couple of followers I want to thank. First, More Coffee Than Human, also known as Lyris L or Lyris L here on Tumblr, also known as Lozzie, also known as one of my very first subscribers and my very first follower on Tumblr. You've been so nice to me from the very beginning, even though I wasn't that good at the start, and your comments and messages always fill me with determination. And also Ameb stuff on Tumblr, Deet Doot Diz or Doot Dee Diz, I can't remember the order right now, and Calico Cantaloupe, Draconian Girl, Glacies Draco, Emmy Muffin, Zacloud X, Minty Morning, Suki no Miyako, and I know many others who I'm forgetting, and I just can't scroll through and find your names on Tumblr right now, so thank you so much for all your support. Oh, and Mia Meow and Brittany Levy here on YouTube. And then after that, I've got another story planned, and I have good reason to believe I'm not going to be alone in reading this one. I've gotten another YouTuber to agree to help me, and they've got a lot more subscribers than I do, so I think you're going to know who they are, but I'm not going to say who it is. I do plan on doing a couple of art streams coming up before that as well, because I am going to be doing the background art for that one instead of borrowing from other people. Oh, and another thank you to all the artists who lent me their work, and the music artists as well whose music I've used. This really wouldn't have been the same without all of that, so thank you so much. This is just, I love the way this community has developed to be so circular in its creativity. Someone like Toby Fox made a game which inspired artists, which inspired fanfiction artists and other people, and it all just goes in a circle. One person inspiring another, and being able to play off each other's ideas and mix and meld and just make an amazing, thriving community. And wrapping this up, also thank you to my boyfriend and my family and pretty much everyone who I've taken time away from in order to get all this stuff done. Their patience and support has been a wonderful blessing, even though at the very beginning I didn't really want anyone to know about this. And yet here we are. My parents planned to come up today to bring me a couch, and I told them, no, I gotta finish a video today, and they were like, okay. So sorry and thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Oh, and also today I'm working on recording a couple things so I can get a regular schedule going again. I know I've promised schedules many times, but I think part of the problem is I've never stopped and allowed myself to get started on the schedule. So going forward, I plan on doing a release of a long fiction, or an episode of a long fiction on Mondays, Thursdays a batch of short stories, which are going to continue, and then Saturdays a Let's Play. And in order to start that, like I said, I'm recording some stuff today. I won't be releasing anything Monday, but I will have something ready Thursday, and the epilogue will come next Monday after that. And then I believe I can get started from there, as long as I can just keep my butt working. So thanks again for your support and patience. I've loved this so much, and I hope to continue bringing you awesome content for as long as I can still speak into a microphone. I love you all so much. See you soon.